Imagine the Egyptian sun, a relentless white-hot eye burning in a sapphire sky. The heat rolls off the limestone blocks of a half-built temple, distorting the air into rippling waves. The Nile nearby smells of lotus and river silt, but also of sweat, animals, and farther off, the faint metallic tang of blood from a sacrifice. We are conditioned to imagine Egypt in terms of serene grandeur. Golden masks, eternal pyramids, statues of pharaohs with faces carved in perfect calm. To us, their civilization looks orderly, timeless, immovable. A place where the journey into the afterlife was carefully measured, where priests whispered prayers in precise cadence, where every detail from hieroglyphs to burial rituals was constructed to maintain balance. But this is only the surface, a deliberate mask, cultivated across centuries. Beneath the gilded calm lies something profoundly alien to our modern minds, something historians whisper about because it unsettles as much as it fascinates. The Egypt we think we know, the land of serene gods and timeless order, was also a place of obsession so dark and practices so unsettling that they would blur the line between sacred and grotesque, between cosmic creation and human violation. At the heart of this paradox was a single, terrifying truth. For the Egyptians, the universe itself was fragile. Everything balanced on the razor's edge between Ma'at order, truth, harmony, and Isfet chaos, darkness, non-existence. Every law, every ritual, every gesture of worship was not simply devotion. It was an act of defense, a bulwark against annihilation. To exist at all meant to fight an endless war against the collapse of meaning. And in this war, the most powerful weapon was not the spear or the sword. It was sex. To the Egyptian mind, sex was not intimacy, nor pleasure, nor even love as we understand it. It was the engine of creation itself, the force that had brought the world into being. If creation began not with a word, but with a physical act, then sexuality was not shameful. It was divine. Dangerous, yes. Raw, yes. But also the very pulse of the cosmos. The pharaoh's virility was more than private vigor. It was national security. If he was potent, the Nile would flood. The crops would thrive. Egypt would endure. If he faltered, the land itself could wither into famine and chaos. Foreigners often missed this darker truth. Greek travelers described Egypt as a place of strange customs, but many still saw it as serene, a land of eternal monuments. They did not understand that what looked like serenity was in fact desperation, the endless work of holding chaos at bay. Every temple was a fortress against disorder. Every statue of a smiling god was a magical shield. Even love, even desire, was transformed into a terrifying public duty. And so, when we peel back the illusion of Egypt as merely calm, golden, and eternal, we uncover something else entirely. A civilization whose obsession with sex as divine creation pushed them into rituals that now seem grotesque, even monstrous, acts that fused power, intimacy, and death into something beyond human comprehension. This is not a story about romance or beauty. It is a descent into Egypt's hidden truth, a world where the act of creation could conquer death, where the pharaoh's body was a cosmic engine, and where desire itself became both salvation and threat. The surface calm of Egypt was never the whole truth. The real Egypt was a battlefield, and its greatest weapon was not carved in stone, but born in flesh. In the beginning, there was nothing. No sky, no earth, no gods, no mortals. Only the swirling silent ocean of primordial chaos the Egyptians called None. Out of this endless void, a solitary being arose, Atum, the first god, who willed himself into existence. He was utterly alone. And in that infinite loneliness, Atum acted. With his own hand, he grasped his phallus. Through an act of divine self-stimulation, he spilled forth creation itself. From his seed and his breath came Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. These two, in turn, gave rise to Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, who then produced Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys, the gods who would shape all human destiny. Think about the staggering implications of this myth. For the Egyptians, the entire cosmos did not begin with a spoken command, as in the traditions of later monotheisms, but with a solitary sexual act. The very first moment of being was not word, not thought, but desire, physical release, and the generative force of seed. To our eyes, it seems raw, even shocking. But to the people of the Nile, it was the divine blueprint for reality. If existence itself had sprung from Atom's act of solitary creation, then sex was never wrong, never shameful. It was sacred. It was not a sin to be hidden, but a cosmic power that could sustain or destroy nations. This belief permeated every corner of Egyptian life. To a farmer standing beside the Nile, the river was not just water, it was the lifeblood, the semen of the earth gods, swelling the land with fertility each year. The yearly inundation was a cosmic ejaculation, a flood of life that made the barren desert bloom. If the flood failed, chaos, Isfet, would win. The Pharaoh, high in his palace, was not just a political ruler. He was Horus incarnate, the living conductor of this divine energy. His potency was a national resource, as vital as grain or gold. His body was not his own. His virility guaranteed the cycle of life, the stability of the cosmos, the survival of his people. To falter in this duty was unthinkable. It was not enough for the pharaoh to claim this role in words. He had to prove it. Through rituals, through public demonstrations of potency, through ceremonies where his sexuality was enacted not as private passion, but as a weapon of cosmic engineering. His body was the hinge of the universe. And yet, here lies the danger. When sexuality is elevated from intimacy into the realm of divinity, when the act itself becomes the key to cosmic order, what happens when human desire mixes with sacred duty? What happens when the personal is erased and only the public, ritualized, and terrifying power remains? It creates a society where sex is no longer personal. It is performance, obligation, ritual. It is no longer about love, but about survival, about holding the world together against the collapse of chaos. Egypt's myths show us how fragile they believed their cosmos to be. Creation had sprung from a single sexual act. To keep creation alive, the act had to be repeated, again and again, by gods, by kings, by priests, even by ordinary men and women through their offerings, prayers, and rituals. Sex was the source code of existence. To control it was to control life itself. But to misuse it, to twist it, was to risk plunging the world back into the black waters of none. And so, as Egypt elevated sex into the divine, it also unleashed a force it could not fully contain. A force that, sooner or later, would spill into obsession, into rituals that blurred the lines between the sacred and the grotesque. The question was not if it would happen, but when. But what happens when a belief system this potent begins to spiral? When sex is no longer private, no longer human, but the very weapon with which gods forged the universe? Inevitably, the sacred begins to blur into the profane. What was once an act of cosmic creation becomes something far darker, twisted by fear, desire, and desperation. For the Egyptians, the stakes could not have been higher. If sex was the engine of creation, then failing to use it properly threatened the balance of the cosmos. Every ritual, every act, every bodily fluid was charged with significance. But when the line between human passion and divine necessity began to dissolve, disturbing practices emerged, rituals and acts that even their contemporaries recoiled from. It was not only the Egyptians themselves who left us these unsettling glimpses. Outsiders Greeks, like Herodotus, travelers and chroniclers of strange customs recorded stories that stripped away Egypt's carefully crafted mask of serene order. To the Greek mind, Egypt was at once a place of astonishing wisdom and alien horror. They saw beauty, but also monstrosity, order, but also grotesque shadows behind the temple walls. And indeed, the Egyptians themselves understood this danger. They knew that if sex was power, then power could be abused. The cosmos itself could be inverted. What was meant to uphold Ma'at could, if misused, unleash Isfet. This is where the story begins to descend into places most modern minds would rather not go. Places where the sacred duties of the living become grotesquely entangled with the bodies of the dead. Places where grief and reverence collapse into obsession. If creation began with Atum's solitary act, if the Nile itself was understood as divine semen, then the Egyptians could not avoid the conclusion that sexual energy might also linger around death. That the dead themselves could be vessels of power, objects both feared and desired. It is here, in the silent, stifling chambers of the embalming houses, that one of the most disturbing testimonies of Egyptian religion surfaces. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, records a tale so scandalous it spread shock even among the Greek elite. The story is not a myth, not a parable, but a supposed account of what happened in the most sacred of Egyptian spaces, the House of the Dead. The embalmer's workshop was meant to be a place of holiness, a threshold between life and eternity. It was here that the body was prepared for its voyage to the afterlife, the soul's passport through the dangerous landscapes of the underworld. Every gesture, every tool, every word was meant to guard the dead against annihilation. But within these chambers, Herodotus tells us, the line between sacred duty and monstrous violation was sometimes broken. What he describes is an act so chilling that it forced the Egyptians themselves to alter their burial customs. An act that revealed just how thin the boundary was between divine order and human depravity. The descent begins here, in the House of the Dead. The Egyptians called it the Wabet, the pure place. But for those who entered, purity was often only a word. The embalmer's workshop was a place of profound contradiction, holy yet polluted, sacred yet foul. Within its walls, the most precious bodies of Egypt were laid bare, stripped, salted, and wrapped, their flesh transformed into a vessel meant to last for eternity. Imagine the scene. The air is stifling, thick with the sweet rot of natron salts and the acrid tang of resin. Flies buzz lazily through shafts of sunlight spilling across stone. On a limestone slab lies the still body of a woman, a noble, a matriarch whose jewelry had gleamed in the banquet hall only days earlier. Around her move the embalmers, craftsmen, not priests, men of specialized skill who knew how to cut, drain, pack, and preserve. They were not aristocrats, not highborn, but men who handled death daily, whose fingers pressed into the cavities of kings and queens. It is here, Herodotus tells us, that the unthinkable happened. One noble family, suspicious and uneasy, delayed their visit to the workshop where their beloved had been delivered, and what they uncovered sent ripples of horror through the Egyptian elite. One of the embalmers entrusted with the most sacred duty of preparing her body for eternity had been caught in the act of violating her corpse. Pause for a moment and think of what this meant to an Egyptian. This was not merely desecration. It was an assault on the very soul. To the Egyptians, the body was the bridge between this world and the next. Within it resided the ka, the vital essence, and the ba, the personality. If the body was desecrated, the soul itself could be imperiled, condemned to wander, or worse, to be devoured by Amit, the eater of the dead. The embalmer's crime was more than lust. It was an act of cosmic rebellion, a grotesque inversion of the very order he was meant to uphold. By seizing the body of a noble woman, a woman of status who in life would never have let him meet her gaze, he was asserting dominance not only over her, but over the fragile ladder of Egyptian society itself. It was Isfet incarnate, chaos intruding into the most sacred chamber. For the family, the revelation was almost unbearable. Their loved one had been stripped of dignity, of purity, perhaps even of eternal salvation. For the wider society, it exposed a terrifying vulnerability, that even in the holiest place of transition, the body could be corrupted. And so, in one of history's most chilling ironies, the Egyptians invented a defense not by further sanctifying the body, but by corrupting it. From that point forward, Herodotus claims the corpses of young and beautiful women were no longer delivered fresh to the embalmers. Instead, the families kept them at home for 3 or 4 days, long enough for the desert heat to begin its work, long enough for the skin to slacken, the flesh to bloat, the bloom of beauty to wither. Only when decay had set in, when the body was no longer alluring, would it be sent for embalming. Think of the paradox. A culture that perfected the art of eternal preservation, a people who could coax skin and hair into lasting thousands of years, chose deliberately to allow the first marks of corruption. For them, this was not failure, it was protection. They feared not the grave, but the living hands of men who could transform sacred preservation into desecration. The embalmer's violation was more than a crime. It was a reminder that even in Egypt, the civilization most obsessed with order, with balance, with eternal life, the shadows of chaos lingered in every ritual, waiting for a single human weakness to let them in. And so, from the silence of the Wabet, a new terror entered Egyptian society. Not the fear of death, but the fear of what might happen after, in the secret chambers where life and eternity were supposed to be bound together. The Egyptians dreamed of eternity. They built pyramids to defy time, carved statues meant to outlast mountains, and perfected the science of embalming so that flesh itself could resist decay. For them, preservation was not vanity, it was salvation. The body was the anchor of the soul, the key that allowed the car and bar to recognize their vessel and reunite in the afterlife. To let it rot was to risk severing the thread of immortality. And yet, faced with the horror revealed in the embalmer's workshop, the same people chose rot as protection. Herodotus tells us that the nobility, terrified by the prospect of necrophilic violation, deliberately allowed their dead to begin decomposing before entrusting them to the embalming table. 3 or 4 days in the sweltering heat of the Nile Valley, long enough for the scent of death to rise, long enough for the skin to swell and the features to blur. Only then, when beauty had curdled into decay, was the body considered safe. It is almost unthinkable. A culture so devoted to eternal preservation willingly allowed its most cherished dead to spoil. The perfect symmetry of their tombs, the delicate artistry of their sarcophagi, the sacred prayers painted in lapis and gold, all of it stood in stark contradiction to this grim practice. Imagine a grieving husband, forced to watch as the skin of his beloved wife darkened and her body bloated, knowing it was the only way to save her from violation. The contradiction reveals something fundamental about the Egyptian mind. They lived in a state of constant tension between beauty and terror, between preservation and corruption. Death was not peaceful rest, it was a battlefield. Every choice carried cosmic weight. Even the decision to let a body rot was framed not as negligence, but as a desperate strategy in the war against Isfet. It is here that the Egyptian obsession with order becomes most visible. They were willing to mutilate their own ideals to preserve the deeper balance. They who sought to defeat decay for all eternity deliberately let decay creep in, just enough to ward off a darker threat. But this compromise carried a haunting irony. To defeat the chaos of lust, they invited the chaos of rot. To protect the soul, they scarred the vessel it depended on. In their desperation, the Egyptians revealed what perhaps they feared most, that Ma'at, the principle of truth, order, and harmony, was always fragile, always under siege, always one act of weakness away from collapse. And yet, as terrifying as this compromise was, it pales beside the contradictions written into their very myths. Because while mortal Egyptians recoiled in horror at the thought of sex with the dead, their gods told a very different story. At the heart of their most sacred myth, the story of resurrection itself stands an act of divine necrophilia. In the stories told by priests and carved into temple walls, death was never the end. For the Egyptians, the most sacred promise was resurrection, and no tale embodied it more than the tragedy of Osiris. Osiris, the good king, was murdered by his jealous brother Set, the embodiment of chaos. His body was hacked into pieces, scattered across the length of Egypt like fragments of a broken cosmos. His sister wife, Isis, refused to accept the annihilation. With tireless devotion, she gathered each limb, each fragment, and through ritual and magic, reassembled her beloved. She anointed him with oils, wrapped him in linen, and whispered spells older than the gods themselves. In doing so, she performed the first act of mummification, the prototype of all that would follow. But when the body was laid whole before her, one part was missing. The phallus of Osiris had been lost to the Nile, devoured by a fish. Resurrection seemed impossible. Without it, the vessel was incomplete. The act of creation could not be renewed. Isis, however, was relentless. Using her magic, she fashioned a new organ. Some myths say of gold, others of clay. Then, in a moment that shocked even the ancient world, she transformed herself into a bird and hovered over the reassembled corpse of her husband. Lowering herself upon him, she united with the dead god, and from this act conceived Horus, the falcon-headed avenger, destined to battle Set and restore order. Pause on this image. For the Egyptians, this was not perversion. It was salvation. The act that mortals feared so much they let their dead decay was, in the divine realm, the holiest moment of all. The universe itself was saved by a goddess committing what to human eyes looked like an unthinkable violation. This paradox reveals the Egyptian genius and terror. They did not see the world in terms of sin and purity, as later faiths would. To them, the act of sex, even with the dead, was not inherently profane. It was raw power, dangerous and transformative, capable of renewing the cosmos itself. Isis's act was not desecration. It was victory. It was Ma'at overcoming Isfet, life clawing its way out of death. Yet imagine how this must have resonated with ordinary Egyptians who heard the myth recited during temple festivals. On one hand, they were warned of embalmers who might desecrate their dead, a fate worse than oblivion. On the other, they worshipped a goddess whose divine necrophilia birthed the very savior of their world. What message did this send to the living? That sexuality was both the greatest threat and the greatest salvation. That the same act could damn a soul to destruction or give birth to the God who protected them all. It is this tension, this paradox, that gave Egyptian religion its eerie power. They did not flee from contradictions, they wove them into the very heart of their cosmology. And it is within the tombs of their kings that we see this logic made flesh. Because the Pharaoh himself, identified in death with Osiris, required the same rituals, the same sexual power, to rise again. And his tomb was not just a house for the dead, it was a resurrection machine. For centuries, we gazed at the tombs of Egypt and thought of them as treasure houses, silent chambers filled with gold and chariots, stacked with food, furniture, and jewelry. A royal storeroom meant to comfort the pharaoh in some distant, vague afterlife. But this was a misunderstanding. The tomb was not a palace for the dead. It was a machine, a biological engine designed to replicate the cosmic drama of Osiris's resurrection, to trigger rebirth through forces the Egyptians considered most potent: magic, ritual, and sex. Deep in these tombs, archaeologists uncovered objects that caused quiet embarrassment in the early days of Egyptology. Small figures, crudely carved in clay or wood, their features rough, their proportions grotesque. Men with exaggerated, oversized erections, scattered near the sarcophagus or placed at the feet of the king. For decades, scholars catalogued them with awkward euphemisms, fertility charms, primitive tokens of virility before quietly consigning them to museum basements. They were rarely displayed, rarely spoken of, but the Egyptians did not hide them. They placed them deliberately. These were not idle symbols. They were tools. They were the physical keys in a ritual so strange, so explicit, that it forces us to reconsider what Egyptian resurrection truly meant. To understand, we must return to the pyramid texts. The earliest religious writings carved into stone more than 4,000 years ago. These were not prayers in the modern sense. They were blueprints, step-by-step instructions for the king's soul. They describe not vague hopes of eternal life, but specific acts that had to be performed, specific powers that had to be awakened. And again, the texts return to one command. The pharaoh, like Osiris, must be made potent again. His phallus must be restored, stiffened, awakened. Only then could the cycle of creation continue. Only then could the living Horus inherit his throne. Here the figurines make sense. They were not charms of luck, but ritual stand-ins, avatars for the king's sexuality, placed close to his inert body. They waited like tools in a machine, ready to be activated by spell, chant, and touch. Imagine the tomb at night, sealed and silent, torches sputtering in the hands of priests, the air heavy with incense, the cries of ritual mourning echoing like the lamentations of Isis herself. The body of the king lies in its sarcophagus, inert, wrapped, incomplete. Around him, these unsettling little figures, silent proxies for his divine member. They are not meant to comfort. They are meant to be used. Egyptologists long resisted this interpretation because it unsettles more than it explains. It suggests that the pharaoh's tomb was not just a house of eternity, but a theatre of resurrection, where sexuality, itself recreated, symbolized, invoked, was the spark that reanimated a god. If so, then every one of those crude figurines was part of a larger design. The tomb itself was not static architecture. It was a ritual chamber, a machine of stone and symbol, waiting to be set in motion by acts we would now call unthinkable. And in the next chamber of this story, the spells inscribed on those walls reveal just how explicit this ritual became. The walls of the royal tomb are not silent. Every surface is alive with spells, incantations, and ritual instructions etched in hieroglyphs. The pyramid texts and the later coffin texts are often called funerary prayers, but that description is far too gentle. They are manuals, cosmic, operating guides that tell the dead king exactly what must happen for his resurrection. And they do not whisper. They are blunt. Spell 534 of the coffin texts commands directly. Raise yourself, O king, for you have not died. Horus has acted for you. He has made your phallus stiff, so that you may beget. This is not metaphor. To the Egyptians, resurrection was inseparable from virility. Without the stiffened organ, without the generative act, rebirth was impossible. The dead Osiris, now identified with the Pharaoh, was incomplete. He could not rise on his own. He required a catalyst. Other spells describe the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, mourning and weeping, then performing the most intimate of rituals. They are told to grasp the king's phallus, to press it against themselves, to draw forth the seed that would ensure continuity. In the silence of the tomb, his resurrection required not only chants and offerings, but an act of sexual magic, reenacted again and again in symbolic form. The figurines scattered near the king's body suddenly take on new life. They were not charms, but stand-ins ritual substitutes that could be activated by priestly hands, by the keening cries of royal women, by the guttural incantations echoing off the limestone walls. These crude shapes were tools, objects of focus, meant to channel the most dangerous and powerful force in the Egyptian cosmos: sex as creation, sex as resurrection. Imagine the scene. The torches flicker, smoke coils upward. The jackal-headed priest of Anubis chants in a voice worn, ragged by repetition. Around the sarcophagus, women wail, their laments rising in waves that mimic the cries of Isis herself. The figurines are touched, invoked, raised as though they are the missing organ of the inert god-king. In that moment, ritual and flesh blur. The dead king's potency is symbolically and magically reawakened. The logic is terrifyingly consistent. If the universe began with Atum's solitary act, if Isis resurrected Osiris through union with his dead body, then the pharaoh must undergo the same. To be reborn as a god, his sexuality had to be conjured back to life, even in death. This collapses the boundaries we cling to, between intimacy and ritual, between family and duty, between purity and violation. What looks to us like incest, necrophilia, even desecration, was to them the most sacred act of cosmic renewal. In their eyes, this was not perverse. It was necessary. It was the engine that turned death into eternity. And yet the Egyptians did not stop at kings. If sexual energy could resurrect a god, might it not also bind the living world together? This logic did not end in the tomb. It spilled out into temples and festivals, where sacred animals themselves became the vessels of divine potency. The most shocking of these rites unfolded not in secret chambers, but in public squares, in the sight of thousands. And at its center was a living god with the face of a ram. From the claustrophobic silence of tombs, we emerge into the Nile Delta, to the vibrant city of Mendes. Here, in courtyards filled with incense and song, Egyptians gathered to worship a god whose power was not abstract, not invisible, but embodied in living flesh. His name was Bane-Jedet, the ram-headed god of fertility and creation. His very name meant the Ba, the soul, of the Lord of Jedet. To his worshippers, he was no distant deity carved in stone. He walked among them, ate their offerings, stared back at them with living eyes. The sacred ram of Mendes was chosen for size, strength, and above all, sexual vigor. He was adorned with gold, tended by priests, and fed the finest foods. Pilgrims traveled for days to glimpse him, to leave offerings, to ask for blessings, especially blessings of fertility. The ram's potency was no mere animal trait. It was the divine energy of creation itself, embodied. His appetite, his virility, his constant readiness were all read as omens of Egypt's future prosperity. But the worship of this god reached a climax in a festival so shocking that even the worldly Greek traveller Herodotus recoiled. He records, almost with disbelief, that during the grand festival of Mendes, a woman often of noble birth was chosen for the highest and most terrifying of honours. In full view of the assembled crowd, she united sexually with the sacred ram. To us, this is grotesque, a violation of every boundary between human and animal. But for the Egyptians of Mendes, it was not bestiality. It was the most direct form of communion with the divine. The woman was not mating with an animal. She was mating with the god himself. In that act, she became his bride, his vessel, a conduit through which the raw, unfiltered force of creation could flow into the human world. Picture the scene. The air heavy with smoke, the sistrums shaking in rhythm, priests chanting hymns while the crowd roars with anticipation. The chosen woman is led forward, adorned like a bride, perfumed, her body painted with sacred oils. The ram, draped in garlands, is brought to her by his attendants. What follows is not hidden but celebrated, a spectacle of flesh and divinity merging before thousands of eyes. Herodotus was horrified. Later, Roman writers echoed the story with disgust. But the Egyptians themselves saw something very different. To them, this was not shameful. It was the highest form of sacred marriage, the cosmic union of animal and human, divine and mortal. Through this act, they believed, the god's energy renewed the land, ensuring fertility for fields, herds, and people alike. And yet, beneath the theology lies something darker. This ritual reveals how far Egypt's obsession with sexual creation could push them. They had stripped away intimacy, stripped away humanity itself, until what remained was a raw biological act, elevated into cosmic theatre. To join with the ram was to abandon the personal entirely. It was to surrender body and dignity in service of the cosmos. Even more unsettling is what this ritual tells us about the Pharaoh. If the divine animal himself required public union to renew creation, then the Pharaoh, as the living Horus, was expected to do the same on a cosmic scale. His sexuality was not his own. It was the axis on which the Nile, the harvest, and the nation itself turned. And in the most crucial ritual of the year, when the floodwaters of the Nile began to rise, the Pharaoh himself was required to act, not with a woman, not with an animal, but with the river that gave Egypt life. Each year, as the heat of summer pressed down on the land, all of Egypt waited for one event, the inundation of the Nile. The flood was everything. Too little water, and famine would stalk the villages. Too much, and entire towns could be swept away. The balance had to be perfect. The Nile was not just a river. It was Egypt's heartbeat, its pulse of life, the difference between civilization and collapse. And the responsibility for that balance rested on one man, the Pharaoh. As Horus on earth, as the son of Osiris, he was the human embodiment of the creative force that had birthed the world. His body was more than flesh. It was a cosmic instrument. His virility was not private. It was the hinge of the universe. So when the Nile began to rise, the Pharaoh did not simply pray for its favor. He acted. In a ritual witnessed by priests and nobles, he walked to the riverbank, carrying the weight of an entire civilization on his shoulders. There, in a ceremony both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling, he performed the most primal act of creation. He masturbated, his seed spilling into a sacred vessel. The priests then poured it into the waters, inseminating the river god Happy. To modern minds, this borders on the grotesque. To the Egyptians, it was cosmic necessity. The pharaoh's seed was not fluid, it was essence, life force, the same divine power that Atum had used to create the first gods. By pouring it into the Nile, the king ensured that the flood would come at just the right level, that chaos would be held back, that the fields would bloom again. Imagine the spectacle. The banks of the river crowded with courtiers, priests chanting hymns, the air thick with incense and expectation. The king, a living god, stands alone before the water. His body is no longer his own. His most intimate act is transformed into public ritual, a performance on which the survival of millions depends. It is the ultimate expression of pharaonic power, the ability to command not armies, not cities, but the very cycle of nature itself. In that moment, the king became a cosmic husband-spouse to the river, partner to the land, father of the harvest. His sexuality was not about desire. It was about binding Egypt to the rhythms of the universe. A single failure could mean drought, famine, death. And yet, this ritual also hints at something far more dangerous. If the pharaoh's body could command the Nile, if his seed could conjure floods and life itself, what else might it command? Could it bind not only the living world, but the dead? Could it reach beyond grief, beyond taboo, and seize power over his own family, his own bloodline, even his own children? These questions are not speculation. They are written in stone, etched into the reign of Egypt's most legendary ruler, a man who turned his grief into obsession, and whose divine authority led him to shatter one of the most sacred taboos of his people. His name was Ramses the Great. For 67 years, Ramses II ruled the two lands. His reign was a monument in itself. Colossal statues rising like mountains, temples carved into cliffs, his name etched onto walls from the delta to Nubia. He was more than a man, he was Pharaoh made flesh, the god-king whose very image became synonymous with Egypt's power. To later generations, he was simply the Great. But beneath the grandeur was a man who loved, and a man who grieved. At the center of his life was Nefertari, his great royal wife. Her very name meant the most beautiful one. She was not just consort, but partner, advisor, and the radiant jewel of his court. Their love is immortalized in her tomb, one of the most breathtaking creations of the Valley of the Queens. Its walls blaze with colors still vivid after 3,000 years. Nefertari greeted by gods, Nefertari walking among stars, Nefertari shining like Hathor herself. No queen of Egypt was ever honored more lavishly. But Nefertari's life was short compared to her husband's. Ramses lived into his 90s, outlasting not only his wife, but many of his own children. When Nefertari died, the void she left was immense. For all his power, all his wives, all his concubines, none could take her place. Her loss was more than personal grief. It was a fracture in the pharaoh's universe. And so, Ramses did something unprecedented. He began elevating his own daughters to the rank of great royal wife. The first was Bintanath, his eldest daughter with Nefertari herself. After her mother's death, Ramses placed her beside him as queen. In reliefs and inscriptions, she takes on all the roles once held by her mother, standing beside the king in ritual, adorned with crowns, invoked in prayers. Later, he did the same with other daughters, Meritamun, Nebetawi. To us, this is incest, a taboo of the highest order. But Ramses was not an ordinary man bound by ordinary rules. He was Pharaoh, living Horus, son of Ra. And in the divine order of Egypt, incest was not only permitted among the gods, it was foundational. Osiris married his sister Isis. Geb lay with his sister Nut. The creator Atum generated children from his own body. To imitate the gods was not perversion, it was godhood. For Ramses, these marriages were more than political convenience. They were acts of preservation. His daughters were not merely his children. They were living echoes of Nefertari, vessels of her divine blood. By marrying them, Ramses was not discarding taboo. He was trying to recapture what he had lost, to preserve the essence of his beloved within the bloodline, to bind her spirit to him again through her daughters. Imagine his world, surrounded by images of Nefertari, haunted by her absence, yet daily faced with her likeness in the faces of their daughters. When he raised Bintenath to queen, did he see his child, or did he see the reflection of his lost wife? In the shadow of grief, boundaries blur. And in the eyes of a man who was also a god, boundaries were things meant to be crossed. This was not lust alone. It was something stranger, a desperate attempt to cheat death itself, to collapse the divide between past and present, between wife and daughter, between human grief and divine authority. Ramses did not simply rule Egypt. He remade the laws of kinship in his own image. But if Ramses could bend the rules of family to his will, what did it mean for those daughters who bore the burden of his obsession? When Ramses raised his eldest daughter Bintenath to the title of Great Royal Wife, the court chroniclers recorded it as a triumph. Reliefs show her crowned, draped in jewels, standing beside her father king as if nothing were unusual. To the Egyptian eye, it was divine imitation. The Pharaoh embodying Osiris, his daughter embodying Isis. But behind the stone images was a human life transformed into something strange, even unbearable. Imagine Bintenath. From childhood, she had been taught to revere her father, not simply as a parent, but as a god. She grew up watching Nefertari, her mother standing beside him in sacred rituals, the queen whose beauty and wisdom were celebrated throughout Egypt. And then her mother was gone. The void she left in Ramses's life yawned open and into it. Bintenath was placed. Now, in ceremonies, she wore the same crowns, the same regalia, carried the same titles. She stood beside Ramses, not as daughter, but as consort. Her public identity became inseparable from her mother's shadow. To the priests and nobles, she was not Bintenath, the girl who once played in the palace gardens. She was the queen, the echo of Nefertari resurrected in flesh. And she was not alone. Ramses later elevated other daughters, Meritamun, Nebetawi, each taking on the role of great royal wife in turn. It was as if the king was not content with one replacement. He multiplied them, recreating fragments of his lost love through the bodies of his own children. To our eyes, this is monstrous. But to Ramses, it was divine logic. The gods themselves had modeled incest as a cosmic necessity. By marrying his daughters, he was proving his godhood, demonstrating that he was above mortal law. His grief became a theatre of power, staged in temples and carved into stone for all to see. Yet the human cost cannot be ignored. What was it to be Meritamun, watching her elder sister crowned as queen, knowing that she too might be summoned to the same fate? What was it to be Nebetawi, given the title of Great Royal Wife, aware that her own body was being used as a vessel for her father's grief, his obsession with preserving a divine bloodline? These daughters were trapped in a paradox. Their father was a god, and to serve him was the highest honor. Yet he was also a man, grieving and clinging to them, not as children but as substitutes for the woman he had lost. They lived as queens, but also as shadows living monuments to Nefertari, reminders of the boundary their father had chosen to erase. Ramses's marriages to his daughters reveal the terrifying end point of Egyptian sacred sexuality. What began as myth Atum creating from himself, Isis uniting with her dead husband-brother, was enacted in the royal court, collapsing the most intimate human bonds into acts of statecraft and ritual necessity. Family itself became raw material, bent into a shape that served the pharaoh's will. Ramses may have been remembered as the greatest of kings, the builder of temples, the father of nations, but in the private heart of his palace, his grief twisted into something darker, a self-created universe where his daughters ceased to be daughters and became the living ghosts of a love he could not let go. It would be easy to believe that these obsessions, sex as creation, incest as divine imitation, necrophilia as resurrection, were confined to the pharaohs and their priests. But they were not. The same currents ran through the lives of farmers, scribes, soldiers, and lovers. For the Egyptians, magic was not metaphor. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life, and the most potent magic of all was sexual. Desire, jealousy, betrayal. These were not private emotions. They were dangerous forces, capable of summoning spirits, twisting fates, even cursing entire households. And to control them, Egyptians turned to spells. Archaeologists have unearthed papyri covered in these incantations, as well as small clay figurines pierced with copper needles, objects that look disturbingly like the voodoo dolls of later traditions. These were not toys. They were weapons in the invisible war of desire. One spell, meant to force a woman named Teromwe to love a man called Kalas, reveals just how brutal these practices were. It does not beg the gods for affection. It commands, do not let her eat, do not let her drink, do not let her sleep. Burn her heart, her liver, her lungs, her bones. Make her eyes ache until she comes to me. Love was not requested. It was demanded, inflicted like a curse. The spell goes further. A doll is inscribed with Taramaway's name, and 13 copper needles are driven into it. Each piercing is accompanied by a declaration. I pierce your head so you think only of me. I pierce your eyes so you see only me. I pierce your heart so you feel only me. I pierce your vulva so you desire no other man but me. This was not poetry. It was magical assault, an attempt to bend another human being's will through ritual violence. Nor was this practice rare. In towns and villages along the Nile, people lived in constant awareness that any strand of hair, any drop of blood or semen could become a weapon. Bodily fluids were thought to carry immense magical power. A man might slip his semen into a potion to bind a lover to him forever. A woman might use a drop of menstrual blood to curse a rival or ensnare a man. The result was a society haunted by paranoia. Your body was never fully yours. A discarded garment, a lock of hair, even a casual spittle on the ground could be collected by an enemy and turned against you. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. The body was porous, vulnerable, a doorway through which magic could pass. Love itself became a battlefield. If a husband strayed, his wife might curse his mistress with barrenness or disease. If a woman was betrayed, she might strike her rival's beauty with a spell that summoned boils or blindness. Even desire was dangerous. To want someone was to risk unleashing powers that might consume both of you. Yet to the Egyptians, this was not grotesque. It was simply how the world worked. Just as the pharaoh's seed could command the Nile, so too could a farmer's semen, a lover's kiss, or a drop of blood command the human heart. The logic was the same from palace to village. Sex was power, sex was magic, and magic was survival. And if this was true for mortals, it was even more true for the gods themselves. For in the myths that every Egyptian child knew, the gods wielded sexuality not as tenderness, but as weapon, twisting it into traps, humiliations, and battles for the throne of the universe. The struggle between Horus and Set was not a single duel, but a long, bitter war. They were uncle and nephew, chaos and order, desert and fertile land. Each claimed the throne of Osiris. For decades of myth, they fought before the tribunal of the gods, hurling accusations, wrestling in rivers, transforming into beasts. But in one of the most shocking episodes, Set chose not to fight with force, but with humiliation. The papyrus known as the Contendings of Horus and Set tells the story. After a feast of reconciliation, Set spread a bed for himself and Horus. When night fell, he forced himself upon his nephew. In the ancient world, penetration was not about desire. It was dominance. The one who penetrated was the master. The one penetrated was reduced, feminized, stripped of power. By this act, Set believed he had destroyed Horus's claim forever. The next day, he would stand before the gods and declare, "I have performed the work of a man against him." But Horus was no passive victim. As Set's semen spilled, Horus caught it in his hands. Furious and ashamed, he carried it to his mother Isis. "See what Set has done to me," he cried. Isis, mistress of magic, did not wail. She acted. With a copper knife, she cut off her son's contaminated hands and threw them into the river, fashioning new ones for him. Then she devised a counterattack as cunning as it was grotesque. She caused Horus's phallus to stiffen and collected his seed in a vessel. Quietly, she spread it over Set's favorite food, lettuce. Later, Set devoured the leaves, unaware that he had swallowed his nephew's seed. The next day, Set strode before the divine tribunal, certain of victory. "Let me be king," he demanded, "for I have humbled Horus. I have performed the work of a man against him." The gods, horrified, spat at Horus, believing him shamed. But Horus stood tall. "It is false what Set has said. Let the seed of Set be summoned, and let us hear from where it answers." The great scribe Thoth spoke the words of summoning. From the marshes where Isis had cast Horus's severed hands, Set's semen answered faintly. The gods hesitated. Then Horus delivered the final blow. "Let my seed be summoned as well." And from within Set's body, a voice answered. The seed of Horus shone like a golden sun, bursting from Set's forehead as a radiant disk. In that moment, Set was humiliated beyond measure. He had not conquered Horus. He had been conquered, impregnated, feminized, made the vessel of his rival's power. The tribunal erupted. Horus's claim was vindicated. This is no gentle myth. It is a brutal parable of power, legitimacy, and humiliation, played out in terms we struggle even to speak aloud. The gods themselves were not serene ideals, but beings who fought with sex as a weapon, who used desire and violation as tools of politics. The Egyptians drew lessons from this. Kingship was not won by force alone. It was won by cunning, by magic, by turning shame into dominance. Horus did not triumph because he was stronger. He triumphed because he turned Set's own weapon back against him, making chaos the vessel of order. And if this was true of gods, it was true of kings. The Pharaoh himself lived in a world where sexuality was both a divine tool and a political theatre. And the myths did not end with Horus and Set. They rippled outward into stories of divine incest, of gods who changed gender, of serpents fashioned from spit and poison. For in the Egyptian imagination, even the most basic bodily fluids could decide the fate of the cosmos. At the root of the Egyptian cosmos lies incest. The first divine children, Shu and Tefnut air and moisture, were siblings. Their children, Geb the earth and Nut the sky, were another brother-sister pair, locked in perpetual embrace until their father tore them apart to create the world. Nut, flung upward, arched across the heavens. Geb, pressed downward, became the ground beneath our feet. Each night, Nut swallowed the sun, taking him into her body, and each morning she gave birth to him again. Creation itself was imagined as a cycle of incest, consumption, and rebirth. From Geb and Nut came Osiris, an Isis brother and sister, husband and wife, and Set and Nephthys, their own sibling pair. The entire divine drama of Egypt, the murder of Osiris, the resurrection by Isis, the battle between Horus and Set, was a family feud, a cycle of incestuous unions passed down from the first act of creation. What mortals recoiled from, the gods embodied as cosmic necessity. And it did not stop there. The gods were not bound by fixed genders or roles. Atum, the first creator, was the great he-she, both male and female, father and mother of himself. Hapi, the Nile flood, was shown as a man with pendulous breasts, embodying nourishment and fertility. Even Ra, the supreme sun god, was not immune to the dangerous sexuality woven into the cosmos. One myth tells how Isis, hungry for power, tricked Ra himself. The great sun god had grown old. As he walked, spittle dribbled from his lips and fell to the earth. Isis gathered it, mixed it with clay, and fashioned a serpent, a living weapon born of the god's own body. She placed it on the path where Ra walked each day. When the serpent struck, its venom coursed through Ra like fire. The creator screamed in agony, his power useless against a poison born of his own essence. The gods rushed to him, but none could heal him. Isis appeared, feigning concern. "What has happened, my divine father?" she asked. "A serpent has bitten me," Ra gasped. "I am burning, I am freezing, my limbs tremble." Isis offered help, but only at a price. "Tell me your secret name," she said, "for only then can I cure you." Ra resisted, listing his many titles, his deeds, his forms, but Isis was unmoved. The poison burned deeper. At last, broken by pain, Ra whispered his true name, the essence of his being, the key to his power. Isis seized it, absorbing his strength. With that, she healed him. But Ra was never the same. His supremacy had been breached. This tale reveals a universe where even the mightiest god could be undone, not by war, but by bodily fluid, by spit transformed into venom, by sex and cunning weaponized as power. It was not love, not tenderness, but domination control wrested through the most intimate of acts. Taken together, these myths paint a cosmos that is terrifyingly alive. The gods lust, betray, trick, humiliate, and devour one another. The order of the world is not serene, but precarious, balanced on a web of incest, violence, and bodily fluids, turned into weapons of creation and destruction. And from these stories flowed the rituals of Egypt, pharaohs marrying their daughters, priests consecrating rivers with seed, women joining themselves to animals, commoners piercing dolls with copper needles. Each act was not aberration, but reflection. They were reenacting the logic of their gods, binding themselves to the same terrible rhythms of cosmic creation. The mask of Egyptian serenity, golden tombs, calm statues, timeless order was just that, a mask. Beneath it lay a civilization that believed sex could resurrect the dead, bend the will of gods, and hold chaos itself at bay. And perhaps that is why their monuments still stand, thousands of years later. They were not only built of stone, but of belief that desire, fear, and violation were not just human weaknesses, but the raw materials of eternity.